I'm Rachel Coleman, 64, and for 20 years I've carried the weight of February 1st, 2003, the day my husband Evan disintegrated in the sky over Texas, aboard the Space Shuttle Columbia. NASA called it a tragic accident, a piece of foam that couldn't have been predicted. I grieved quietly, raised our daughter alone, and trusted that his death meant something. But last month, while organizing Evan's old files for our daughter's college project, I found a letter he'd hidden, one that mentioned ongoing concerns about tile damage and requests for satellite imagery being denied. The betrayal didn't just shatter my heart, it ignited a fire that's been smoldering for 2 decades. What I uncovered next would expose a web of institutional negligence that goes far deeper than one tragic morning. And the truth about Evan's final days would change everything I thought I knew about his death and about the people who could have saved him. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt betrayed by institutions that promise to protect the ones you love, like this video for a story of truth, justice, and a widow's quiet revolution. The wedding photo sits on my mantle, yellowed at the edges, but still radiant with the hope we carried in 1982. Evan's dress blues, my grandmother's pearls, and that smile that could light up mission control back when we believed the future belonged to dreamers like us. We met at Edwards Air Force Base when I was 22, fresh out of college and working as a communications specialist. Evan was 24, already a test pilot with eyes that sparkled when he talked about space. "Rachel," he'd say, pulling me close on those desert nights, "someday I'm going to touch the stars. And I want you right there with me when I come home." The path to NASA wasn't easy. We moved 7 times in our first 5 years of marriage, from Edwards to Patuxent River, then to the Naval Test Pilot School, each assignment bringing Evan closer to his astronaut dream. I packed our life into boxes again and again, building new friendships only to leave them behind. But I never complained. How could I? Watching Evan's face when he talked about orbital mechanics or thermal protection systems was like watching a child on Christmas morning. Emma arrived in 1987, right after Evan's acceptance into the astronaut program. I remember holding her tiny hand while we watched his first shuttle launch on television, her eyes wide with wonder at the thunder of engines. "That's Daddy's work," I whispered, and she clapped her chubby hands like she understood. Those early years at Johnson Space Center felt magical. The astronaut families formed a tight community. We barbecued together, celebrated birthdays, and shared the unique anxiety of loving someone who literally shot for the stars. The children grew up thinking it was normal to have parents who traveled at 17,000 miles per hour. Evan loved being a father almost as much as he loved flying. He'd spend hours building model rockets with Emma, explaining thrust-to-weight ratios to our 6-year-old, like she was a graduate student. "Space isn't just about going up," he'd tell her. "It's about coming home with something valuable: knowledge, perspective, hope." By the late 90s, our life had settled into a rhythm. Evan's missions were routine: deploy satellites, conduct experiments, return safely. The space program had matured beyond the dangerous frontier days of the early years, or so we thought. The night before his final mission, Evan held me longer than usual. I thought it was just pre-flight nerves, the same butterflies he'd had before every launch. "Take care of Emma," he said, his voice soft in the darkness. "Make sure she knows how proud I am of her. You'll tell her yourself in 2 weeks," I replied. But something in his tone made me shiver. I should have paid attention to that feeling. I should have asked more questions. But back then, I trusted NASA completely. They were the experts, the professionals who had kept my husband safe for over a decade. They were the guardians of America's greatest technological achievement. Looking back now, I realize how naive we all were. We trusted the system because we needed to be, because the alternative was too terrifying to contemplate. We believed in the myth of infallible engineering, in the promise that every risk had been calculated, every contingency planned. That the photo on my mantle captures that innocence perfectly. To young people in love, ready to conquer the universe together, we had no idea that the very institution we trusted with our dreams would one day become the keeper of our nightmares. The morning began like Christmas and ended like a funeral. I woke early, excited for Evan's homecoming. After 16 days in orbit, Columbia was scheduled to land at Kennedy Space Center at 9:16 a.m. Eastern. Emma, now 15 and perpetually embarrassed by her parents' enthusiasm, had agreed to skip her Saturday morning volleyball practice to watch the landing with me. "Mom, you're bouncing," she said, rolling her eyes as I paced around the kitchen. Unable to sit still, the official NASA statement about the mission's success was already printed and waiting on my counter, a routine document I'd collected from every one of Evan's flights. The coffee tasted better that morning. The February sunshine streaming through our Houston windows seemed warmer. Even the morning news anchors seemed more cheerful as they discussed Columbia's successful mission and impending return. At 8 a.m., I called my sister in California. "Evan's coming home today," I said, unable to keep the joy from my voice. "The experiments went perfectly. He's bringing back crystal samples that might revolutionize pharmaceuticals. Give him my love," she replied, "and tell him to keep his feet on the ground for a while." Emma and I settled on the couch at 8:30, the television tuned to NASA's live coverage. The mission commentator's voice was calm and routine. "Columbia is performing nominally as she approaches the California coast. All systems are functioning normally as the crew prepares for their return to Earth." At 8:59 a.m., they lost contact at first. The commentator's voice remained steady. "We've had a loss of signal from Columbia. This is not unusual during re-entry due to the plasma field surrounding the vehicle. We expect to re-establish contact momentarily." But minutes passed, then more minutes. Emma reached for my hand, her teenage bravado forgotten. The commentator's voice began to crack. "We are still working to re-establish contact with Columbia. Flight controllers are evaluating the situation." At 9:16 a.m., when Columbia should have been rolling to a stop on the runway, the phone rang. It was Janet Stevens, wife of Columbia's pilot. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Rachel, turn on the regular news. The image on CNN will haunt me forever. A brilliant streak of light breaking apart against the clear Texas sky. Debris raining down like falling stars." The anchor's voice was grave. "What you're seeing is the apparent breakup of the Space Shuttle Columbia over East Texas." Emma's scream pierced the morning air. My own voice seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. No, that's not right. That's not our shuttle," but it was. The official NASA statement I'd proudly collected that morning suddenly felt like a mockery in my hands. All those routine words about nominal performance and successful mission completion meant nothing now. The doorbell rang at 10:30. Through the peephole, I saw the dark suits and solemn faces of NASA's casualty notification team. I knew, but I opened the door anyway. "Mrs. Coleman, I'm Admiral Harrison from NASA headquarters. May we come in?" The words that followed were clinical, rehearsed, devastating. Loss, tragic accident, heroes who died in service to their country. They spoke of debris fields and recovery efforts, of investigations and eventual answers. But all I could think about was the last thing Evan had said to me: "Take care of Emma." The official explanation came later that day. A piece of foam insulation had broken away from Columbia's external fuel tank during launch, striking the leading edge of the left wing. The damage had allowed superheated gases to enter the wing structure during re-entry, causing the catastrophic failure. It was impossible to predict, the NASA spokesperson assured the gathered media. This was a tragic accident, but not something that could have been foreseen or prevented. I believed them. Why wouldn't I? They were the experts, the people who had safely launched and landed over 100 shuttle missions. They spoke with authority and conviction, backed by decades of engineering excellence. The funeral was held at Arlington National Cemetery on a cold February day. Evan's coffin was draped with an American flag, and a NASA honor guard presented me with another flag, folded into a perfect triangle. "On behalf of a grateful nation," the officer said, "for his service to the space program and to our country." Standing there in my black dress, holding Emma's trembling hand, I felt proud even in my grief. Evan had died doing what he loved, pushing the boundaries of human knowledge and exploration. His sacrifice meant something. It had to. For 20 years, I carried that belief like a sacred trust. Evan was a hero who died in a tragic but unavoidable accident. That's what NASA told us. That's what the investigation concluded. That's what I needed to believe to keep breathing. I should have known better. I should have asked harder questions. But grief is a powerful anesthetic, and sometimes the truth is too painful to face until you're strong enough to bear it. Evan's personal journal sat in my bedroom drawer for 2 decades, too painful to read but too precious to discard. The leather cover was worn smooth from his hands, filled with his thoughts about missions, family, and the future we'd planned together. Single motherhood at 44 was a challenge I'd never imagined. Emma needed stability, normalcy, and strength, qualities I wasn't sure I possessed while drowning in grief. The NASA family support system was remarkable those first few years. Counselors, financial advisors, and other widows helped me navigate the practical aspects of sudden loss while learning to be both mother and father to a traumatized teenager. "Why did Dad have to die?" Emma asked me one night, about 6 months after the accident. We were looking through photo albums, trying to keep his memory alive. "Sometimes bad things happen to good people," I replied, the standard answer that satisfied no one. Dad knew the risks when he became an astronaut. He believed space exploration was worth those risks. But Emma's questions grew more sophisticated as she matured. "Mom, why didn't they check the tiles during the mission? Couldn't they have done something if they'd known about the damage?" I'd give her the party line. "The foam strike was too small to detect, honey. Even if they'd known, there was nothing they could have done." These were the explanations NASA had given us, and I repeated them like articles of faith. The annual Columbia Memorial Services became a fixture in our lives. We'd gather with the other families at Arlington, then later at Johnson Space Center, listening to speeches about sacrifice and exploration. The names of our 7 crew members were read aloud, their photographs displayed prominently, their contributions to science celebrated. I found comfort in these rituals. They validated our loss, gave it meaning within the larger narrative of human achievement. When NASA officials spoke about lessons learned and safety improvements, I felt proud that Evan's death had made space travel safer for future crews. But sometimes, in quiet moments, doubts crept in. I'd read news articles about the investigation, about engineered dissent and management pressure. There were whispers in the astronaut community about budget cuts and schedule pressures. I'd quickly dismissed these thoughts. They felt like betrayals of Evan's memory. Emma graduated high school in 2006, 3 years after the accident. She'd chosen to study aerospace engineering, inspired by her father's legacy. "I want to make space travel safer," she told me during her valedictorian speech. "I want to honor Dad by preventing other families from going through what we've experienced." I was so proud of her strength, her determination to transform tragedy into purpose. She was accepted to MIT, where she threw herself into her studies, with the same passion Evan had brought to his work. During her college years, Emma would sometimes call with technical questions about the Columbia accident. Her engineering courses were giving her a deeper understanding of the systems that had failed. "Mom," she said during one late-night conversation, "some of my professors think the foam strike damage should have been detectable. They think there might have been options for repair or rescue." My heart would race during these conversations. "Emma, we've been over this. The investigation was thorough. NASA's best engineers concluded that the accident was unpreventable." "No, Mom, I just wish we could have saved him." So did I, more than she could ever know. The 10th anniversary of the accident brought renewed media attention. Documentaries were produced, articles written, and experts interviewed. Most reinforced the official narrative. But a few raised uncomfortable questions about communication failures and risk assessment. I forced myself to watch them all, looking for closure that never came. One documentary featured an anonymous NASA engineer who claimed that managers had refused to pursue satellite imagery of Columbia's wing damage during the mission. The engineer's voice was disguised, his face obscured, but his words haunted me. "We could have tried. We should have tried." I called NASA's Public Affairs Office the next day. "I'm Rachel Coleman, widow of Columbia mission specialist Evan Coleman. I'm calling about the documentary that aired last night." The response was swift and reassuring. "Mrs. Coleman, we understand your concern. These conspiracy theories surfaced periodically, but I can assure you that our investigation was comprehensive and accurate. Your husband died in a tragic accident, but not one that could have been prevented." I wanted to believe them. I needed to believe them. The alternative that Evan's death had been preventable was too agonizing to contemplate. Emma graduated from MIT in 2010 with honors, then began her master's degree in aerospace safety systems. She was brilliant, dedicated, and driven by a desire to honor her father's memory. She was also beginning to ask questions I couldn't answer. The 15th anniversary memorial service was smaller than usual. Some families had moved on, choosing private remembrance over public ceremony. But I was there, as always, listening to the familiar words about sacrifice and exploration. After the service, I overheard a conversation between two NASA officials. One was complaining about persistent rumors and conspiracy theorists who won't let the Columbia story rest. The other replied, "Time heals all wounds. Eventually, people will stop asking questions." But I was beginning to realize that time hadn't healed my wounds, it had simply taught me to live with them, and maybe, just maybe, it was time to start asking some questions of my own. That night, I finally opened Evan's journal, for the first time since his death. His handwriting was achingly familiar, his thoughts intimate and revealing. Most entries were routine mission preparations, family moments, technical observations, but scattered throughout were references to concerns, to safety discussions, to frustrations with management decisions. One entry, dated just weeks before his final mission, made my blood run cold. The tile inspection issue keeps coming up in crew meetings. We all know the foam strikes have been getting worse, but the schedule pressure is intense. I just hope we're not pushing our luck too far. I closed the journal and put it back in the drawer. I wasn't ready for those questions yet, but they were starting to ask themselves. Emma's senior project at MIT was ambitious. A comprehensive analysis of the Columbia accident using 20 years of hindsight and advanced modeling techniques. She'd requested access to Evan's personal papers, hoping to find insights that might inform her research. "I need to understand exactly what Dad was thinking before the mission," she explained during her Christmas break visit in 2022. His perspective as a mission specialist might reveal details that weren't included in the official investigation. I'd been dreading this moment for years. Evan's papers were stored in our spare bedroom, boxes of files and documents I'd never had the courage to examine thoroughly. The official investigation had requested copies of relevant materials, but I'd kept the originals sealed away like artifacts in a tomb. On a cold January morning, Emma and I began the process of organizing and cataloging everything: flight manuals, mission briefings, technical specifications, and personal correspondence. The accumulated documentation of a distinguished career cut tragically short. Emma approached the task with scientific rigor, creating digital scans and detailed inventories. I found myself reliving memories with each document: the excitement of Evan's first flight assignment, the pride of his space station missions, the anticipation of his final Columbia flight. "Mom, look at this," Emma said, holding up a thick flight manual. "There's something tucked inside the back cover." My heart stopped. It was a letter, folded carefully and hidden between the manual's pages. The paper was NASA letterhead, but the handwriting was Evan's. It was addressed to me, dated 3 days before his final launch. "My dearest Rachel," it began, "if you're reading this, then my worst fears have come true, and I'm no longer here to protect you from the truth." My hands shook as I continued reading. Emma moved closer, her own eyes wide with shock. "The foam strike problem has been getting worse with each mission, and some of us have been raising concerns about the thermal protection system's vulnerability. I've been part of several discussions with engineering teams about the need for better tile inspection capabilities and contingency plans for tile damage." The letter went on to describe a series of email exchanges between Evan and his fellow crew members, discussing their growing unease about management's dismissive attitude toward safety concerns. He mentioned specific instances where requests for satellite imagery had been denied, where engineering recommendations had been overruled by schedule pressures. "We've been told repeatedly that foam strikes are a maintenance issue, not a safety concern," Evan wrote. "But some of the engineers I trust most are privately expressing doubts about this assessment. If something happens to Columbia, I want you to know that it didn't have to happen." Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "Mom, Dad knew. He actually knew there were problems." The letter concluded with words that shattered my world. "I'm going ahead with the mission because I believe in what we're doing. But I'm also going because I trust NASA to keep us safe. If that trust is misplaced, then I need you to ask the hard questions I couldn't ask. The families deserve the truth, Rachel, all of it." I sat in stunned silence, the letter trembling in my hands. 20 years of carefully constructed beliefs were crumbling around me. The tragic accident I'd mourned had been something else entirely, a preventable disaster that NASA had chosen to characterize as unavoidable. Emma found the email thread Evan had mentioned, printed copies tucked into another folder. The exchanges were between Columbia's crew members and several NASA engineers, dated throughout the months leading up to the mission. The tone was increasingly frustrated, with multiple references to management resistance and budget-driven decisions. One email from mission specialist Dave Harrison was particularly damning. "We're flying a vehicle with known vulnerabilities and inadequate inspection capabilities. This feels like Russian roulette with a shuttle attached." Another, from pilot Willie McCool, mentioned a conversation with thermal protection system engineers who had serious concerns about our ability to detect and repair tile damage in orbit. The email included a forwarded message from an engineer named Patricia Hayes, who had written, "The foam strike data from recent missions shows an escalating pattern. We need to address this before we lose a crew." Emma's laptop was open beside her, and she was already searching for information about Patricia Hayes. "Mom, she left NASA in 2004, about a year after the Columbia accident. She's now a professor at Georgia Tech, teaching aerospace safety." I stared at the documents spread across our dining room table. Each piece of paper represented a small crack in the official narrative I'd believed for 2 decades. Together, they formed a devastating picture of institutional negligence and willful blindness. "What do we do with this?" Emma asked, her voice hollow. I didn't have an answer. The evidence was overwhelming, but it was also 20 years old. The investigation had been concluded, the families had been compensated, and the space program had moved on. What purpose would be served by reopening old wounds? But as I looked at my daughter's face, I saw the same determination that had driven Evan to become an astronaut. She deserved to know the truth about her father's death, even if that truth was more painful than the fiction we'd been living. "We start by finding Patricia Hayes," I said, surprising myself with the firmness in my voice. "If she's still alive, she might be able to help us understand what really happened." Emma nodded, already typing on her laptop. I found her faculty page. She's still teaching at Georgia Tech, specializing in aerospace, safety, and risk management. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Evan's letter, about the trust he'd placed in NASA, and the trust I'd placed in their official explanation. I thought about the 20 years I'd spent defending their narrative, participating in memorial services that celebrated a lie. Most of all, I thought about the other families. Did they know? Had they found similar evidence? Or were they still living with the same false comfort I'd clung to for so long? The next morning, I called Patricia Hayes. Dr. Patricia Hayes answered on the 3rd ring, her voice cautious when I introduced myself as Evan Coleman's widow. There was a long pause after I explained why I was calling. "Mrs. Coleman, I've been wondering when this day would come," she said finally. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask the right questions." We arranged to meet at a quiet coffee shop near Johnson Space Center the following week. I spent those days diving deeper into the technical reports Evan had hidden, trying to understand the engineering language that revealed the truth NASA had concealed. The technical report I found buried in Evan's files was damning. An internal NASA document titled Thermal Protection System Vulnerability Assessment, confidential, dated 6 months before Columbia's final mission. It detailed extensive analysis of foam strike damage patterns and concluded that current inspection capabilities are inadequate to detect critical damage scenarios. The report recommended immediate implementation of on-orbit inspection procedures and development of contingency repair capabilities. In the margins, someone had handwritten budget implications, prohibitive and schedule impact unacceptable. When I met Patricia Hayes, I barely recognized the confident engineer from the NASA photos I'd found online. She was in her 70s, now, her hair silver and her eyes haunted by decades of carrying secrets. "I brought copies of everything," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table. "Internal memos, engineering assessments, meeting minutes, all the documentation they tried to bury after the accident." Patricia's story was heartbreaking. She'd been a thermal protection system specialist for over 20 years. One of NASA's leading experts on shuttle tile technology. In the months leading up to Columbia's mission, she'd become increasingly alarmed by the escalating pattern of foam strikes and the agency's reluctance to address the underlying problems. "We knew the external tank was shedding larger pieces of foam with each mission," she explained, her voice tight with emotion. "We'd been documenting it, analyzing it, and repeatedly recommending design changes. But every proposal was rejected due to cost and schedule concerns." The classified memo she showed me was devastating. It was an internal NASA communication from December 2002, just 2 months before Columbia's launch, discussing the conflict between safety concerns and budget pressures. The memo explicitly stated that accepting increased risk levels may be necessary to maintain program viability. I wrote 17 separate reports about tile vulnerability, Patricia continued. I attended dozens of meetings where I presented data showing that a large foam strike could cause catastrophic damage. Each time, I was told that the probability was acceptable and that inspection capabilities were adequate. But the most shocking revelation came when Patricia described a meeting held just days after Columbia's launch. When mission controllers first noticed the foam strike during launch video review, there was a group of us who immediately recognized the potential danger, she said. We requested satellite imagery to assess the damage, and we were told it wasn't necessary. When we pushed harder, we were told it wasn't possible due to national security constraints. The truth was even worse than I'd imagined. Not only had NASA known about the tile vulnerability before the mission, but they'd also had opportunities to assess and potentially address the damage after it occurred. Instead, they'd chosen to maintain the mission schedule and hope for the best. Why didn't you go public? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Patricia's laugh was bitter. I tried. I wrote a detailed report for my supervisors, outlining exactly what had happened and why. I was told that my analysis was speculative and that speaking publicly about internal deliberations would violate my security clearance and employment contract. She'd been quietly forced into early retirement in 2004. Her warnings dismissed as the concerns of an overly cautious engineer. For 20 years, she'd watched NASA's sanitized version of events become accepted history, knowing that the real story was far more damning. Your husband wasn't just a victim of a tragic accident, Patricia told me as our meeting concluded. He was a victim of institutional cowardice and calculated risk acceptance. NASA chose to gamble with 7 lives rather than admit they had a serious problem they couldn't afford to fix. Driving home from that meeting, I felt a fury unlike anything I'd experienced since the immediate aftermath of Evan's death. But this anger was different. It was focused, purposeful, and directed at the people who had betrayed not just my family, but every family who'd trusted NASA with their loved ones' lives. That evening, I called Steve Williams, Columbia's payload commander, who had survived the Challenger disaster 17 years earlier. Steve had always been supportive of the families, attending memorial services, and staying in touch with many of us over the years. Rachel, I've been expecting this call, he said when I explained what I'd discovered. There are things I couldn't say before, but maybe it's time. Steve confirmed much of what Patricia had told me. He described a culture within NASA where engineers' concerns were routinely dismissed by managers, focused on maintaining flight schedules and congressional funding. He'd seen the same pattern repeat itself across multiple missions, with safety considerations taking a backseat to political and economic pressures. The tragedy isn't just that we lost Columbia, he said. It's that we lost Columbia for all the wrong reasons. If NASA had been honest about what they knew and when they knew it, maybe we could have prevented future accidents. Instead, they created a false narrative that made the same mistakes more likely to happen again. By the end of that week, I had accumulated a devastating collection of evidence. Internal documents, engineering reports, meeting minutes, and witness testimony that painted a picture of systematic negligence and deliberate deception. NASA hadn't just failed to prevent the Columbia disaster. They'd actively concealed the information that might have saved my husband's life. Emma was home for spring break. When I finally shared everything I'd learned, she sat in stunned silence. As I laid out the timeline of institutional failures, the deliberate choices that had prioritized politics over people. Mom, she said finally, we have to do something with this. Dad's letter said the families deserved the truth, all of it. She was right. But I also knew that taking on NASA would be like David facing Goliath, except Goliath had unlimited resources, legal immunity, and 20 years of practice deflecting inconvenient questions. Still, as I looked at the evidence spread across our dining room table, I knew I had no choice. Evan had trusted NASA to keep him safe, and they'd betrayed that trust. For 20 years, I'd trusted them to tell me the truth about his death, and they'd betrayed that trust. It was time to stop trusting and start fighting. The classified memo Patricia Hayes slipped me during our second meeting changed everything. Marked internal use only and dated January 15, 2003, just 2 weeks before Columbia's launchit was a smoking gun that proved NASA's leadership had knowingly accepted unacceptable risks. Budget constraints necessitate continued operations. Despite elevated risk assessment, the memo stated in bureaucratic language that barely concealed its deadly implications. Thermal protection system vulnerabilities will be addressed in future vehicle modifications pending funding authorization. Patricia's hands shook slightly as she explained the context. This memo was the result of a closed-door meeting between senior management and the program office. We engineers weren't invited, but I received a copy from someone who was there, someone who was as horrified as I was by what they were deciding. The meeting had been called to address mounting concerns about foam strikes and tile damage. Engineering teams had presented data showing a clear escalation in the size and frequency of foam debris impacts. They'd recommended immediate implementation of inspection and repair capabilities, regardless of cost. The response was chilling, Patricia continued. We were told that the shuttle program was under intense congressional scrutiny, and that any significant budget increases or schedule delays would jeopardize the entire program. The decision was made to accept the increased risk rather than fight for proper funding. What made this revelation even more devastating was the timeline. This meeting had occurred just weeks before Evan's final mission. NASA's leadership had literally calculated that it was cheaper to risk losing a crew than to implement proper safety measures. I couldn't sleep for weeks after I saw that memo, Patricia said. I kept thinking about the crews who were training for upcoming missions, completely unaware that their safety had been sacrificed to budget politics. She'd tried to raise her concerns through official channels, but her warnings were dismissed as overly conservative and not aligned with program objectives. When she'd persisted, she'd been reassigned to less critical projects and gradually frozen out of important decisions. They have very sophisticated ways of silencing dissent, she explained. They don't fire you outright, that would create documentation and potential legal issues. Instead, they isolate you, marginalize your input, and make your work life so miserable that you eventually leave on your own. The pressure had been intense and personal. Patricia's security clearance had been subjected to routine review, her travel had been restricted, and her access to critical systems had been gradually reduced. Colleagues who had previously sought her expertise began avoiding her, clearly having received guidance about her reliability issues. The worst part was watching the Columbia crew during their final training. She said, tears forming in her eyes. I'd see them in the hallways, so excited about their mission, so trusting that we were keeping them safe. I wanted to warn them, but what could I say? That their own agency was gambling with their lives. Patricia showed me another document that made my stomach turn, a risk assessment worksheet that quantified the probability of crew loss due to tile damage. The analysis concluded that there was a 1 in 276 chance of catastrophic failure due to thermal protection system breaches that were deemed acceptable within program parameters. They literally calculated that losing a crew was statistically tolerable, Patricia said bitterly. Evan and his crewmates weren't people to these decision-makers, they were acceptable losses in a larger political and economic equation. Memo also revealed the extent of NASA's preparation for potential disaster. Contingency plans had been developed for managing public relations in the event of a thermal protection system failure, including pre-drafted statements about tragic but unforeseeable accidents and inherent risks of space exploration. They were ready to lie before the disaster even happened, I realized, the full scope of the betrayal becoming clear. Patricia nodded grimly. The official narrative was crafted before Columbia ever launched. If something went wrong, they already knew exactly what they were going to tell the families and the public. What made Patricia's story even more compelling was her impeccable credibility. She'd worked for NASA for over 2 decades, had received multiple commendations for her engineering excellence, and had no personal grudge against the agency beyond her commitment to safety and truth. I loved NASA, she said simply. I believed in the mission, in the importance of space exploration, in the integrity of the people I worked with. But somewhere along the way, the institution became more important than the people it was supposed to serve. Her decision to speak with me hadn't been easy. Even 20 years later, she worried about potential retaliation, lost consulting contracts, damaged relationships, legal challenges to her retirement benefits. But Evan's letter, which I'd shared with her, had convinced her that silence was no longer an option. Your husband was right, she said, referring to Evan's hidden message. The families do deserve the truth. All of it. Patricia also provided me with contact information for other former NASA employees who might be willing to share their experiences. Engineers, technicians, and administrators who had witnessed the systematic prioritization of politics over safety but had been afraid to speak publicly. There's a whole network of us, she explained. People who left NASA because they couldn't stomach what the agency had become, or who were forced out because they asked inconvenient questions. We've stayed in touch over the years, sharing our frustrations and our guilt about staying silent. As our meeting concluded, Patricia gave me a final piece of advice that would prove prophetic. Be prepared for NASA to fight back. They have unlimited resources, skilled public relations teams, and decades of experience managing inconvenient truths. They'll try to discredit your evidence, question your motives, and paint you as a grieving widow who can't accept that accidents happen. She was right, of course, but she was also right about something else. The truth has a power that no amount of institutional spin can ultimately overcome. Driving home with Patricia's documents in my passenger seat, I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders. This wasn't just about Evan anymore, it was about every family who had trusted NASA with their loved ones, every crew member who had flown missions knowing they were unnecessarily at risk, and every future astronaut whose safety depended on the lessons we chose to learn from Columbia's loss. That night, I called Emma at MIT. I need you to come home, I told her. We're going to take on NASA, and I'm going to need your help. Emma arrived home from MIT on a red-eye flight, her face grim with determination. I'd sent her encrypted copies of all the documents I'd gathered, and she'd spent the flight analyzing them with the technical expertise I lacked. "Mom, this is worse than I thought," were her first words as she walked through our front door. The engineering data shows they knew exactly what would happen if a large foam piece hit the wing's leading edge. We sat in Evan's study, surrounded by his books and memorabilia, while Emma played the last voice recording he'd made for us. It was a personal message recorded 3 days before launch, meant to be delivered if something went wrong during the mission. "My beautiful girls," Evan's voice filled the room, as warm and loving as I remembered. "If you're hearing this, then I'm not coming home, but I need you to know how much you've meant to me." Emma wiped away tears as her father's voice continued. "Rachel, you've been my anchor, my safe harbor in every storm. You've sacrificed so much for my dreams, and I hope I've made you proud. Emma, my brilliant daughter, you have your whole life ahead of you. Don't let my absence define your future. Let my love for you light your way." But then, Evan's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "I also need you both to know that I've had concerns about this mission. There are safety issues that some of us have raised, but the pressure to maintain the flight schedule is intense. I'm going ahead because I trust NASA to keep us safe. But if something happens, please don't just accept the first explanation you're given. Ask hard questions. Demand real answers." Emma's hands clenched into fists. "He knew, Mom. Dad actually knew he might not come back, and he went anyway because he trusted them." Her initial reaction was denial, much like mine had been. Despite her engineering background and analytical mind, the emotional impact of learning that her father's death had been preventable was overwhelming. "This can't be right," she said, pacing around the study. NASA's investigation was exhaustive. They interviewed hundreds of people, analyzed thousands of pieces of debris, spent years determining exactly what happened. How could they have gotten it so wrong? I showed her Patricia Hayes' classified memo and the timeline of ignored warnings. Emma read through the documents with growing anger, her technical training allowing her to understand the implications that I was still struggling to grasp. "They didn't get it wrong," she said finally. "They lied, deliberately and systematically." Emma's fury was different from mine, more focused, more analytical. She began creating detailed timelines and technical analyses, cross-referencing the hidden documents with the official investigation report to identify specific discrepancies and omissions. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a section of the official report. "They claim that the foam strike damage couldn't have been detected during the mission. But here's an internal email from an engineer saying they could have used Department of Defense satellites to get high-resolution images of the damage." Her anger extended beyond NASA to her own career choices. Emma had spent years studying aerospace engineering specifically to honor her father's memory and improve space safety. Learning that his death had been preventable made her question everything she'd worked toward. I've been trying to solve a problem that was already solved 20 years ago, she said bitterly. The engineering solutions existed, NASA just chose not to implement them. But Emma's anger at NASA was matched by her anger at me for keeping her in the dark for so long. When I explained that I'd only recently discovered the truth myself, she struggled to believe that I could have been so naive for 2 decades. Mom, you had access to Dad's files all this time. How could you not have found his letter until now? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself. The honest answer was that I hadn't wanted to find it. Opening Evan's personal papers would have meant confronting the reality of his death in a way I wasn't emotionally prepared to handle. I was protecting myself, I admitted. And maybe I was protecting you too. Sometimes ignorance feels safer than truth. Emma's response was swift and unforgiving. That's not your choice to make. Dad died because people prioritized institutional protection over truth. How are you any different? Her words stung because they contained an uncomfortable kernel of truth. By accepting NASA's official narrative without question, I had become complicit in the very cover-up that had cost Evan his life. But Emma's anger was also productive. She threw herself into research with the same intensity she'd brought to her studies, using her technical background to analyze the engineering failures and her generation's digital nativity to uncover additional evidence online. There are forums where former NASA employees discuss the Columbia accident, she discovered. People have been sharing doubts and concerns for years, but no one's put together a comprehensive challenge to the official story. Emma found several retired engineers who had worked on thermal protection systems, mission controllers who had been present during Columbia's final flight, and even former NASA administrators who had witnessed the political pressures that influenced safety decisions. We need to contact the other families, Emma insisted. They have a right to know what we've discovered. This was the moment I'd been dreading. Reaching out to the other Columbia families would mean shattering their carefully constructed acceptance of their loved ones' deaths. Some might welcome the truth, but others might see our revelations as a cruel reopening of old wounds. Emma's perspective was uncompromising. Mom, imagine if another family had this information and chose not to share it with us. How would you feel? She was right, of course. The other families deserved to know what we'd learned, regardless of how painful that knowledge might be. Emma also pushed for immediate public disclosure. Her generation's approach to institutional wrongdoing was fundamentally different from mine, where I instinctively sought to work within the system. She believed in the power of public pressure and media attention. We should go to the press, right now, she argued. The longer we wait, the more time NASA has to prepare their response and discredit our evidence. But I wasn't ready for that level of exposure. Taking on NASA would require careful preparation, legal advice, and strategic planning. Emma's impatience was understandable, but it could also be counterproductive. We get one chance at this, I told her. If we go public without proper preparation, NASA will destroy our credibility and bury the truth for another 20 years. Emma's final question haunted me long after our conversation ended. Mom, if we'd known the truth 20 years ago, do you think we could have prevented other accidents? I didn't have an answer. But I knew that if we didn't act now, with the evidence we'd uncovered, we might never get another chance to hold NASA accountable for their betrayal of the families who trusted them most. The government contract Emma found in Evan's files was a sobering reminder of how thoroughly NASA had protected itself from accountability. The liability waivers and indemnification clauses were extensive, designed to shield the agency from virtually any legal challenge related to crew safety. Attorney Michael Torres listened patiently as I laid out our evidence in his downtown Houston office. He was a specialist in government accountability cases, someone Patricia Hayes had recommended after her own legal consultations following her forced retirement. Mrs. Coleman, I'm going to be brutally honest with you, Michael said after reviewing our documents. What you've uncovered is damning, but proving legal liability against NASA will be extraordinarily difficult. He explained the multiple layers of legal protections surrounding government space programs. The Federal Tort Claims Act provided broad immunity for discretionary government functions. The contractor agreements Evan had signed included extensive waivers of claims against NASA, and the statute of limitations for most potential causes of action had expired years ago. NASA's lawyers aren't stupid, Michael continued. They've had decades to insulate the agency from exactly this type of challenge. Every astronaut contract, Every mission agreement, every safety protocol, is designed to transfer risk away from NASA and onto the individual participants. The government contract Emma had discovered was particularly revealing. Buried in its dense, legal language were clauses that specifically absolved NASA of liability for design defects, maintenance failures, or operational decisions related to crew safety. Evan had essentially signed away his family's right to hold NASA accountable for the very negligence that had killed him. Michael showed us similar contracts from other high-risk government programs, military test pilots, CIA operatives, nuclear workers. The government has perfected the art of legal immunity, he said. They accept the benefits of these programs while transferring all the risks to the people who actually do the work. But our case had some unique elements that might create legal openings. The evidence of deliberate concealment and false statements to families could potentially support claims of fraud or intentional misrepresentation. If we could prove that NASA had knowingly provided false information about the accident's causes, their immunity protections might not apply. The key is showing that they didn't just fail to prevent the accident, Michael explained. We need to prove they actively deceived the families about what happened and why. Patricia Hayes' classified memo was crucial evidence, but it also presented legal challenges. The document was marked as internal use only, potentially making it classified information that couldn't be used in court without proper procedures. We'll need to be very careful about how we handle this, Michael warned. NASA could claim that using classified documents violates federal security laws, which would give them grounds to have our entire case dismissed. The other families' experiences with legal action were discouraging. Michael showed us records from previous lawsuits filed by Columbia families, all of which had been dismissed on grounds of government immunity or contractual waivers. The Harrison family spent 4 years and over $200,000 trying to prove negligence, Michael said, referring to the family of Columbia's mission specialist. The case was dismissed at summary judgment, and they were ordered to pay NASA's legal costs. Emma was frustrated by the legal obstacles. So NASA can literally kill people through negligence and face no consequences. Michael's answer was uncomfortably honest. In many cases, yes, government immunity laws were designed to protect agencies from being paralyzed by litigation. But they've created a system where accountability is nearly impossible to achieve. However, he did see some potential avenues for legal action. Recent court decisions had created narrow exceptions to government immunity in cases involving intentional wrongdoing or fraud. If we could prove that NASA had deliberately concealed material facts from the families, we might be able to pursue claims under these exceptions. The challenge is meeting the evidentiary burden, Michael explained. We'd need to prove not just that NASA made mistakes, but that they intentionally deceived the families with knowledge that their statements were false. Emma's technical analysis of the engineering documents was crucial to this strategy. Her work had identified specific discrepancies between what NASA knew internally and what they told the families publicly. For example, Emma had documented, NASA told us that the foam strike damage couldn't have been detected during the mission. But their own internal emails show that multiple engineers requested satellite imagery that could have revealed the extent of the damage. Michael was impressed by Emma's thoroughness. This is exactly the kind of evidence we need. Specific, documented contradictions between internal knowledge and public statements. But he also warned us about the personal costs of taking on NASA. Government agencies had unlimited resources and sophisticated legal teams, specifically trained to defend against accountability challenges. They'll investigate your personal lives, question your motives, and try to portray you as grieving relatives who can't accept that accidents happen, Michael said. They'll argue that you're dishonoring your husband's memory by suggesting he died for anything other than the noble cause of space exploration. The financial risks were also significant. Even if we could overcome the immunity protections and prove our case, NASA could appeal any adverse judgment for years. Legal costs could easily exceed hundreds of thousands of dollars, with no guarantee of recovery. And if we lose, Michael added, you could be liable for NASA's legal fees, which could be substantial. Emma was undeterred by these warnings. Money isn't the point. We want accountability, not compensation. But accountability through the legal system seemed increasingly unlikely. Even if we could prove NASA's negligence and deception, The most probable outcome would be a settlement with confidentiality clauses that would prevent us from sharing our findings publicly. That's how these cases usually end, Michael explained. The government agrees to pay some money in exchange for the family's silence about what really happened. By the end of our consultation, it was clear that the legal system was not going to provide the accountability we sought. The government had constructed an elaborate framework of immunity and waivers specifically designed to prevent families like ours from holding agencies like NASA responsible for their failures. So what do we do? I asked Michael, as our meeting concluded. His answer was sobering. You could spend years and all your resources fighting a legal battle you're almost certain to lose. Or you could focus on public accountability, media attention, congressional oversight, public pressure. Sometimes shame is more powerful than legal liability. Emma and I left Michael's office with a new understanding of the obstacles we faced. NASA wasn't just protected by engineering expertise and government authority. They were shielded by layers of legal immunity that made traditional accountability nearly impossible. But we also left with a new sense of purpose. If the legal system couldn't hold NASA accountable, then we'd have to find other ways to ensure that the truth about Evan's death wasn't buried forever. The mission control transcript that Sarah Williams sent me was like reading the final moments of my husband's life through the eyes of the people who were supposed to protect him. Sarah had been a flight controller during Columbia's mission, one of the voices in the room when everything went wrong. I've been carrying this guilt for 20 years, Sarah said, when we met at a quiet restaurant near Johnson Space Center. I was there when the first concerns were raised about the foam strike. I watched the debates about whether to request satellite imagery. I saw the politics override the engineering. Sarah was younger than I'd expected, probably in her 50s. Now, with graying hair and the tired eyes of someone who'd witnessed institutional failure firsthand, she'd left NASA 5 years after the Columbia accident, unable to reconcile her love for the space program with her knowledge of how the agency actually operated. The mission control transcript she'd preserved was officially classified, but Sarah had kept a personal copy because she'd known that someday, someone would need to understand what really happened in those final days. On flight day 2, Sarah explained, we had clear evidence of the foam strike from the launch video. Multiple people in mission control recognized that this was a larger debris impact than we'd seen before. The transcript showed a series of discussions between flight controllers, engineers, and mission managers about the potential significance of the foam strike. What struck me most was how quickly the concerns were dismissed by senior management. Flight Controller 1, we're seeing what appears to be a significant debris impact on the left wing leading edge. Mission Manager, define significant. Are we talking about a maintenance issue or a safety concern? Flight Controller 1, sir, we won't know without better imagery. Request permission to contact DoD for satellite reconnaissance. Mission Manager, negative. We don't have authority for that level of intelligence asset utilization. Sarah's voice was bitter as she read from the transcript. That was the moment when we could have saved them. We had the technology, we had the capability, but we didn't have the institutional courage to admit we had a serious problem. The conversations continued for several days, with multiple requests for satellite imagery being denied by increasingly senior levels of NASA management. Engineers provided detailed analysis of potential damage scenarios, but their warnings were consistently overruled by officials focused on maintaining mission schedules. The most frustrating part, Sarah continued, was watching the crew go about their daily activities, completely unaware that we were debating whether they were going to survive. The transcript revealed that serious discussions had been held about the possibility of a rescue mission. The shuttle Atlantis was being prepared for its next flight, and could potentially have been launched early to retrieve Columbia's crew. Flight Director Engineering Assessment indicates potential for catastrophic failure during re-entry. Program Manager, what are our options for crew recovery? Flight Director Atlantis could be accelerated for launch readiness, but we're looking at minimum 3 weeks preparation time. Program Manager, negative. We're not authorizing contingency operations based on speculative damage assessment. Sarah's hands shook as she showed me that section of the transcript. They literally decided it was better to gamble with 7 lives than to admit they might have a problem. A rescue mission would have required them to acknowledge that Columbia was in danger, which would have meant acknowledging that they'd launched a mission with known vulnerabilities. What made the transcript even more damning was the revelation that NASA had multiple contingency plans for different types of in-flight emergencies. but no plan for tile damage assessment or repair despite years of warnings about foam strike risks. The decision not to tell Columbia's crew about the potential danger was perhaps the most morally questionable aspect of the entire sequence of events. Mission controllers debated whether to inform Evan and his crewmates about the foam strike and the concerns it had raised. We could have given them the choice, Sarah said, tears forming in her eyes. We could have told them what we knew and let them participate in the decisions about their own lives. Instead, we kept them in the dark and made choices for them based on political and institutional considerations. Flight surgeon, medical recommendation is to inform crew of potential issues. Stress levels are manageable, and they have a right to know. Mission manager, negative. No point in creating anxiety about a situation we can't control. Continue normal operations. Sarah also revealed that NASA's public statements during the mission were deliberately misleading. While mission controllers were expressing serious concerns internally, NASA's Public Affairs Office was issuing statements about the mission's nominal performance and routine operations. We were living in two completely different realities, Sarah explained. Internally, we were preparing for potential disaster. Externally, we were maintaining the fiction that everything was fine. The transcript also documented the moment when mission controllers realized that Columbia was breaking apart during re-entry. The clinical language barely concealed the horror of watching people they'd worked with for years dying in real-time. Flight Controller 2, loss of signal from Columbia. All telemetry ceased at 9 hours, 0 minutes, and 18 seconds. Mission elapsed time. Flight Director, contingency procedures, notify, search and rescue, activate family notification protocols. Mission Manager, Public Affairs, prepare standard statement about communication, loss during re-entry. Sarah's voice broke as she read that final exchange. Even as we watched them die, the first priority was managing the public narrative. They were already crafting the story that would protect NASA from accountability. But perhaps the most revelatory part of Sarah's account was her description of the post-accident investigation. She'd been interviewed multiple times by the Columbia Accident Investigation Board, but her testimony about the denied requests for satellite imagery had been heavily edited in the final report. I told them everything, Sarah said, about the requests for satellite imagery, about the debates over rescue missions, about the decision to keep the crew uninformed, but most of that never made it into the published report. She showed me a copy of her original testimony compared to what was included in the final investigation report. Key sections about management decisions and political considerations had been removed or significantly modified. They turned a story about institutional failure into a story about technological complexity, Sarah observed. The report made it sound like we did everything possible, when the truth is that we did everything expedient. Sarah also provided contact information for other former mission control personnel who had similar experiences with the investigation. Engineers, flight controllers, and support staff who had witnessed the systematic prioritization of politics over safety but had been pressured to remain silent. There's a whole community of us, she said. People who left NASA because they couldn't live with what the agency had become, or who stayed but never stopped feeling guilty about what we knew and couldn't say. As our meeting concluded, Sarah made me promise to share her story with the other families. They deserve to know that we failed them, she said simply. Not the technology, not the engineering, not the inherent risks of spaceflight. We failed them. The people they trusted to keep their loved ones safe made choices that prioritized institutional protection over human lives. Driving home with Sarah's transcript in my briefcase, I felt a new level of rage at the scope of NASA's betrayal. It wasn't just that they'd concealed the truth after the accident. They'd concealed the truth during the mission when that concealment cost 7 people their lives. Evan had trusted NASA to tell him if he was in danger. Columbia's crew had trusted their ground support to make decisions in their best interests. That trust had been violated in the most fundamental way possible, not through incompetence or honest mistakes, but through calculated choices to prioritize institutional interests over human lives. That night, I called Emma. We're not just fighting for Dad anymore, I told her. We're fighting for every astronaut who's ever trusted NASA with their life, and for every family who's ever believed the lies they were told about how their loved ones died. The congressional hearing transcript Senator Maria Gonzalez shared with me was a masterclass in political theater, dated 6 months after the Columbia accident. It showed NASA officials providing carefully crafted testimony that bore little resemblance to the internal discussions I'd discovered. "Mrs. Coleman, I've been waiting for someone like you to come forward," Senator Gonzalez said when we met in her Washington office. "I served on the Space Subcommittee during the Columbia investigation, and I knew we weren't getting the whole truth." Senator Gonzalez was in her 70s now, a respected veteran of congressional oversight who had spent decades watching government agencies protect themselves from accountability. She'd grown increasingly frustrated with NASA's evasive answers during the post-Columbia hearings. Every time we asked specific questions about pre-accident safety concerns, we got bureaucratic non-answers, she explained. NASA officials would acknowledge that foam strikes were a known issue, but they insisted that no one could have predicted the specific failure mode that destroyed Columbia. The hearing transcript was filled with exchanges that, in light of what I'd learned, revealed a systematic pattern of deception. NASA Administrator Sean O'Keefe had testified under oath that all available options for crew safety were thoroughly evaluated during the mission. Senator Gonzalez's questioning had been pointed. "Mr. O'Keefe, are you telling this committee that NASA had no capability to assess the extent of tile damage during Columbia's mission?" O'Keefe's response had been carefully parsed. "Senator, our standard inspection procedures indicated no critical damage. Additional assessment capabilities were not required based on the information available to mission controllers." "That's a lie," Senator Gonzalez told me bluntly. "We now know that multiple requests were made for satellite imagery, and that engineers had serious concerns about the foam strike." O'Keefe's testimony was technically accurate, but completely misleading. The political pressure surrounding the Columbia investigation had been intense. The shuttle program was already under congressional scrutiny due to budget overruns and schedule delays. A finding that NASA had been negligent in crew safety would have threatened the entire human spaceflight program. There was enormous pressure to find that Columbia was a tragic accident rather than a preventable disaster, Senator Gonzalez explained. The political reality was that Congress needed to maintain public support for NASA, which meant accepting the narrative that this was an unforeseeable technical failure. Behind the scenes, negotiations had shaped the investigation's scope from the beginning. NASA had successfully argued that certain documents and communications were too sensitive for congressional review. Claiming national security and operational security concerns, they stonewalled us at every turn, Senator Gonzalez said. "When we requested internal communications about the foam strike, we were told that releasing such documents would compromise future mission safety. When we asked for personnel records of engineers who had raised concerns, we were told that would violate privacy rights." The senator showed me her personal notes from closed-door briefings that weren't included in the public hearing record. NASA officials had privately acknowledged more extensive problems than they were willing to admit publicly. In one briefing, a NASA engineer told us that foam strikes had been a growing concern for years, but that budget constraints prevented implementation of adequate inspection and repair capabilities, Senator Gonzalez recalled. But when we asked him to repeat that testimony in public, he claimed he'd been misunderstood. The political calculations were complex and morally compromising. Congress needed to appear tough on NASA accountability while maintaining funding for the space program. NASA needed to accept some responsibility while protecting the institution from existential threats. The result was a choreographed investigation that satisfied no one, Senator Gonzalez said. "We got enough admissions of failure to justify oversight reforms, but not enough truth to threaten the program's political support." The senator also revealed the extent of lobbying pressure during the investigation. Aerospace contractors, NASA employee unions, and space advocacy groups had all worked to limit the scope of congressional scrutiny. "The message was clear," she explained. "Push too hard on NASA accountability, and you risk being blamed for killing America's human spaceflight capability." It was political blackmail disguised as patriotic concern. Senator Gonzalez had tried to push for more aggressive oversight, but she'd been isolated within her own party. Other committee members were more interested in protecting NASA than in uncovering uncomfortable truths about institutional failures. "I proposed subpoenaing internal NASA communications and bringing in whistleblowing engineers for protected testimony," she said, "but I couldn't get support from my colleagues, who were worried about being seen as anti-space exploration." The congressional hearing transcript also revealed how NASA had prepared for congressional scrutiny. Agency officials had been coached on how to answer specific questions, and potentially damaging documents had been classified to prevent congressional access. They gamed the system perfectly, Senator Gonzalez observed. They provided just enough cooperation to avoid charges of obstruction while withholding anything that would have revealed the full scope of their negligence. What frustrated Senator Gonzalez most was her knowledge that similar patterns of institutional protection had played out in other government agencies. The same legal and political mechanisms that protected NASA from Columbia accountability had been used to shield other agencies from oversight of their failures. It's a systemic problem, she said. Government agencies have learned how to insulate themselves from accountability by claiming that transparency threatens operational effectiveness. Congress has largely accepted this argument because it's politically easier than fighting institutional resistance. The senator's advice was sobering. Don't expect Congress to provide the accountability you're seeking. The political incentives haven't changed since 2003. Most members still see NASA as politically valuable and don't want to damage the agency's reputation or funding. But she also offered encouragement. Public pressure can sometimes accomplish what congressional oversight cannot. If you can generate enough media attention and public outrage, politicians will be forced to respond in ways they wouldn't choose voluntarily. Senator Gonzalez provided me with contact information for congressional staff members who had worked on the Columbia investigation and might be willing to share their experiences privately. She also suggested reaching out to government accountability organizations that specialized in exposing institutional cover-ups. The truth has a way of eventually surfacing, she said as our meeting concluded. It may take longer than you'd like, and it may require more persistence than you think you have, but institutional lies can't be sustained forever. As I left the Capitol building, I reflected on the layers of betrayal my investigation had revealed. NASA hadn't just lied to the families, they'd lied to Congress, to the media, and to the American people. They'd turned a preventable tragedy into a political tool for protecting their institutional interests. But I also felt a new sense of determination. If the people we'd elected to provide oversight had failed in their responsibilities, then it was up to citizens like me to demand the accountability our democratic system had promised but failed to deliver. The conflict between public accountability and protecting the space program was real, but it was also a false choice. The best way to protect America's space capabilities was to ensure that agencies like NASA operated with integrity and transparency, not to shield them from the consequences of their failures. That night, I called Emma again. We're not just fighting NASA anymore, I told her. We're fighting a system that prioritizes institutional protection over truth, political convenience over accountability. But Senator Gonzalez is right, the truth has a way of surfacing, and our job is to make sure it surfaces now, not in another 20 years. The investigative report draft that journalist David Chen showed me was devastating, and it would never see the light of day. Titled Columbia's Preventable Tragedy: How NASA Chose Politics Over Lives. The unpublished article laid out a comprehensive timeline of institutional failures and I spent 8 months researching this story, David explained, as we sat in his cramped home office, surrounded by boxes of documents and transcripts. I had corroborating sources, internal documents, smoking gun evidence. My editors loved it until they killed it 3 days before publication. David had covered the original Columbia disaster for a major news network, and he'd never been satisfied with the official explanations. When I contacted him with my evidence, he'd immediately recognized the significance of what I'd discovered. Your husband's letter and Patricia Hayes' memo confirm everything I suspected but couldn't prove, he said. NASA didn't just fail to prevent the accident, they actively concealed their knowledge of the risks from the crew and the families. David's unpublished article was meticulously researched and powerfully written. He'd interviewed dozens of former NASA employees, analyzed thousands of pages of documents, and constructed a timeline that clearly showed the agency's systematic prioritization of institutional protection over human safety. The piece opened with a scene from Mission Control during Columbia's final days, using Sarah Williams' transcript to show how quickly safety concerns had been dismissed by senior management. It then traced the history of foam strike problems back to the shuttle program's earliest days, revealing a pattern of ignored warnings and deferred solutions. The most damning part was the section on NASA's post-accident media strategy, David said, scrolling through his draft. I found evidence that they'd prepared their public narrative before they'd even completed their investigation. But the article had never been published because of pressure from both government and corporate sources. David's editor had received calls from NASA's Public Affairs Office, expressing concerns about irresponsible speculation and potential damage to ongoing safety improvements. More significantly, the network's parent company had contracts with NASA for documentary and educational programming. Publishing David's article would have jeopardized millions of dollars in revenue and access to NASA facilities and personnel. That's how the system works, David explained bitterly. Media companies depend on government access and corporate advertising. When those interests conflict with investigative journalism, journalism usually loses. David had tried to place the story with other outlets, but the response had been consistently disappointing. Smaller publications lacked the resources to verify his claims and defend against potential legal challenges. Larger outlets were similarly constrained by their business relationships with government and aerospace contractors. The space program has a unique place in American culture, David observed. Criticizing NASA feels unpatriotic to many people, especially when that criticism involves the deaths of astronauts. Editors are afraid of being seen as attacking American heroes. The media's initial enthusiasm for my story had followed a similar pattern. When I first contacted journalists with my evidence, several had expressed immediate interest. Reporters from major newspapers and television networks had requested interviews and document copies, but that enthusiasm had cooled rapidly as the implications of the story became clear. One television producer had told me bluntly that challenging NASA's Columbian narrative would require resources we don't have and create enemies we can't afford. David showed me emails from his editor explaining why the Columbia article had been killed. The justifications were revealing: too speculative, potential legal liability, insufficient news value 20 years after the fact, and concerned about damaging NASA's current safety culture. Those are all code words for this story is too dangerous to touch. David translated, media executives have learned to kill controversial stories before they become problems. The corporate pressure extended beyond media companies to their advertisers and business partners. Aerospace contractors spent millions of dollars on television advertising and sponsored content. Challenging NASA's credibility could potentially affect those revenue streams. Boeing was one of Columbia's primary contractors, David pointed out. They have billions of dollars in current NASA contracts and spend heavily on media advertising. No network wants to risk that relationship over a 20-year-old story. Even supposedly independent media organizations were constrained by their funding sources. Public radio stations received government grants that could be threatened by controversial reporting. Online publications depended on access to official sources for future stories. David's experience with the Columbia story had convinced him that the modern media landscape was fundamentally incompatible with aggressive government accountability. Journalism, the business model, doesn't support the time and resources required to take on powerful institutions, he said. But he also believed that social media and independent platforms had created new opportunities for bypassing traditional media gatekeepers. The story that major networks won't touch can still reach millions of people through blogs, podcasts, and viral sharing. David offered to help me develop a media strategy that didn't depend on traditional outlets. We could create a comprehensive website documenting our evidence, produce a podcast series detailing the investigation, and use social media to build public awareness. The key is making the story impossible to ignore, he explained. If we can generate enough public attention, traditional media will be forced to cover it, even if they don't want to. But David also warned me about the potential backlash. NASA had sophisticated public relations teams specifically trained to manage controversial narratives. They would likely respond to any media attention with aggressive countermessaging, designed to discredit our evidence and motivations. They'll paint you as a grieving widow who can't accept that accidents happen, he predicted. They'll question your technical competence, suggests that you're being manipulated by disgruntled former employees, and imply that you're dishonoring your husband's memory. The media landscape had changed dramatically since 2003, and not necessarily for the better. In terms of accountability journalism, news cycles were shorter, attention spans were limited, and complex investigative pieces struggled to compete with simpler, more sensational stories. 20 years ago, a story like this would have dominated news coverage for weeks. David said. Now, it might get buried under the next political scandal or celebrity controversy. But there were also advantages to the current media environment. Social media allowed direct communication with audiences without traditional gatekeepers. Independent journalists could build sustainable businesses around specialized coverage, and public appetite for institutional accountability stories had grown in response to various government and corporate scandals. As our meeting concluded, David made me an offer. I can't get this story published through traditional channels, but I can help you tell it through alternative ones. We can build a multimedia investigation that reaches people directly, without depending on editors or executives who are more interested in protecting their business relationships than pursuing truth. It was a tempting offer, but it also represented a fundamental shift in how I thought about accountability and justice. Instead of working within established systems, legal, political, or media, I was being asked to create alternative channels for pursuing truth. That night, I discussed David's proposal with Emma. "Mom, traditional media failed us just like the legal system and Congress failed us," she said. "Maybe it's time to stop asking permission from institutions that benefit from keeping the truth buried." She was right. If the established systems for accountability had been captured by the interests they were supposed to oversee, then we needed to find new ways to ensure that the truth about Evan's death finally reached the people who deserved to hear it. Group photo from our first meeting still sits on my desks. Families gathered around Patricia Hayes' dining room table, united by a shared sense of betrayal and determination. We called ourselves the Columbia Truth Coalition, and we represented the first organized challenge to NASA's official narrative in 20 years. Finding the other families had been surprisingly difficult. NASA had been careful to manage our relationships after the accident, providing individual support while discouraging collective action. We'd been encouraged to grieve privately rather than organize publicly. Janet McCool, wife of pilot Willie McCool, was the first to respond to my outreach. "Rachel, I've been waiting for someone to start asking these questions," she said during our initial phone call. Willie left behind notes about safety concerns that never made it into the official investigation. Rick's husband's widow, Evelyn, had discovered similar discrepancies between her husband's private communications and NASA's public statements. Rick mentioned the foam strike problem in emails to me. She revealed he was worried about the increasing frequency and size of debris impacts. Dr. Kalpana Sala's family had immigrated to India after the accident, but her brother Sanjay had maintained contact with the other families. He flew in from Mumbai for our first meeting, bringing documents that Kalpana had sent to their family, expressing concerns about mission safety. "My sister was a perfectionist," Sanjay explained. "She would never have remained silent if she truly believed the mission was routine. Her letters to us suggested she had concerns that weren't being addressed." Dave Brown's sister, Susan, had kept detailed records of NASA's communications with the family after the accident. Comparing those records with what we'd learned revealed a pattern of misleading statements and selective disclosure. "They told us that Dave died instantly, that there was no suffering," Susan said. "But the timeline documents show the crew was probably conscious and aware during the breakup sequence. They lied to us about even the most basic facts." Laurel Clark's husband, John, brought the technical expertise our group needed. As a naval flight surgeon, he understood both the medical and engineering aspects of the accident. His analysis of the crew's final moments was devastating. The crew's survival investigation that NASA conducted internally was much more detailed than what they shared with us. John revealed they knew exactly what the crew experienced, but they chose to give us a sanitized version that was easier to accept. Our first meeting lasted 12 hours. We spread documents across Patricia's dining room table, comparing evidence and sharing discoveries. The pattern that emerged was unmistakable. NASA had systematically concealed the truth from all of us, but our group wasn't unanimously committed to public disclosure. Michael Anderson's widow, Sandy, attended our first meeting but expressed serious reservations about challenging NASA's narrative. "I've spent 20 years building a life around the belief that Michael died as a hero in service to humanity," she said. "If we prove that his death was preventable, what does that do to his legacy?" Sandy's concerns reflected a deeper conflict within our group. We all wanted accountability, but we also wanted to preserve the dignity and heroism of our loved ones' sacrifices. NASA had skillfully constructed a narrative that made questioning the accident feel like questioning the crew's courage and commitment. Tom husband, Rick's father was particularly conflicted. "My son believed in the space program," he said. "He knew the risks and accepted them. Does proving NASA's negligence honor his memory or diminish it?" These weren't easy questions, and our group spent considerable time working through the emotional and philosophical implications of our investigation. We concluded that true honor came from ensuring that our loved ones' deaths led to meaningful improvements in safety and accountability. Emma attended several of our meetings as our technical advisor. Her engineering background helped us understand the complex systems failures that had led to the accident, and her youth brought a different perspective to our discussions. "The older generation tends to trust institutions more than mine does," she observed. "For people my age, holding powerful organizations accountable isn't disrespectful, it's essential for a functioning democracy." Our support network extended beyond the immediate families. We connected with former NASA employees who had been marginalized for raising safety concerns, journalists who had investigated aspects of the Columbia story, and aerospace engineers who understood the technical failures better than we did. Dr. Alan McDonald, who had famously opposed the Challenger launch 17 years earlier, became an informal advisor to our group. His experience with NASA's institutional resistance to accountability was invaluable. "The same patterns that led to Challenger led to Columbia," he told us. "NASA learned how to manage public relations after accidents, but they didn't learn how to prevent accidents from happening." Our weekly conference calls became a lifeline for processing both the emotional and practical challenges of our investigation. We shared resources, coordinated research efforts, and provided mutual support. When the weight of what we'd discovered became overwhelming, the group also served as a reality check for our more ambitious plans. When Emma and I proposed immediate public disclosure, the other families helped us understand the importance of careful preparation and strategic timing. "We get one chance at this," Janet McCool reminded us. "If we go public before we're ready, NASA will discredit us, and the truth will be buried for another 20 years. Our discussions revealed how NASA had used different tactics with different families. Some had been overwhelmed with official support and attention, making them feel special and important. Others had been isolated and given minimal information, keeping them dependent on NASA for answers. "They knew exactly how to manage each of us," Evelyn Husband observed. "The families who asked too many questions got less access. The families who accepted the official story got more support. But our group also faced internal challenges. The grief counseling we'd all received had emphasized acceptance and moving forward, not investigation and accountability. Some family members struggled with the idea that reopening these wounds might be psychologically harmful. Patricia Hayes served as both our technical expert and our emotional anchor. Her experience as a NASA insider gave her credibility with the families, while her own marginalization helped her understand our frustrations with institutional stonewalling. "You're not dishonoring your loved ones by seeking truth," she reminded us repeatedly. "You're honoring them by ensuring their deaths lead to meaningful change." Our group photo was taken at the end of our third meeting. After we'd formally committed to pursuing public disclosure of our findings, we looked determined but also apprehensive, aware that we were about to challenge one of America's most respected institutions. Looking at that photo now, I'm struck by how ordinary we appear. We weren't activists or revolutionaries, we were grieving families who had discovered that the people we'd trusted most had betrayed us in the most fundamental way possible. But we were also something else. We were proof that institutional power depends ultimately on public consent, and that even the most sophisticated cover-ups can't survive when people refuse to accept comfortable lies instead of difficult truths. The Columbia Truth Coalition represented more than just 7 families. Seeking accountability, we represented the principle that in a democracy, no institution, no matter how respected or important, be allowed to escape responsibility for the consequences of their failures. Our support network gave us the strength to continue when the task seemed impossible, and the wisdom to proceed carefully when our emotions might have led us astray. Most importantly, it reminded us that we weren't alone in our quest for truth and justice. The satellite images arrived in my email at 3:17 a.m., sent by an anonymous source who identified himself only as a friend of truth. The subject line read, "What NASA didn't want you to see: Columbia's final days." I'd been awake anyway, unable to sleep, as our group prepared for public disclosure of our findings. Emma was staying with me that week, helping organize our evidence and coordinate with the media strategy David Chen had developed. The images were stunning and heartbreaking. High-resolution photographs of Columbia in orbit, taken by a classified Defense Department satellite 3 days before the accident. The damage to the left wing's leading edge was clearly visibly gaping hole where foam impact had stripped away thermal protection tiles. "Mom, you need to see this," Emma called from her laptop in the kitchen. She'd been researching the technical specifications of the satellite that had taken the images. This satellite had the resolution to detect damage smaller than what killed Dad and his crew. NASA could have seen exactly what was wrong. The anonymous source had included a technical analysis with the images, written by someone with obvious expertise in spacecraft systems and orbital mechanics. The analysis concluded that the visible damage would have been immediately recognizable as a mission-ending threat requiring emergency response. But the most damning aspect of the leak wasn't just that the images existed, was that they'd been available during Columbia's mission. The satellite had photographed the shuttle on Flight Day 7, 9 days before the accident. There had been time for assessment, planning, and potentially even a rescue mission. Emma pulled up the mission timeline we'd constructed from Sarah Williams' transcript and the other documents we'd collected. "Look at this, Mom." On Flight Day 7, Mission Control was still debating whether to request satellite imagery. These photos proved the images were already being taken. The technical analysis included detailed calculations showing that a rescue mission would have been possible if NASA had acted immediately upon receiving the satellite images. The shuttle Atlantis could have been prepared for an emergency launch within 14 days, while Columbia's crew could have extended their mission for up to 30 days with careful resource management. "They didn't just know Columbia was doomed," Emma said, her voice filled with rage. "They knew they could have saved everyone, and they chose not to." I called Patricia Hayes immediately, despite the early hour. She was awake too, having received the same email from the same anonymous source. "Rachel, these images are exactly what we requested during the mission," Patricia said, her voice shaking. "This is proof that the capability existed, that the intelligence community was monitoring the shuttle, and that someone in the chain of command decided not to share this information with the people who could have acted on it." Patricia explained the significance of the satellite's designation and the technical details visible in the images. The damage was even worse than the anonymous analysis had indicated, not just missing tiles, but structural damage to the wing's underlying framework. "No thermal protection system could have survived re-entry with this level of damage," Patricia said. "Anyone with minimal training in spacecraft systems would have immediately recognized this as a catastrophic failure waiting to happen." The images also revealed the sophistication of the cover-up that followed the accident. NASA's post-accident analysis had claimed that the extent of the damage couldn't have been determined during the mission, but these photographs showed damage that was unmistakably fatal, captured with technology that was routinely available to mission planners. Emma contacted our anonymous source, hoping to learn more about how the images had been obtained and why they were being leaked now. The response came within an hour. 20 years of institutional lies are enough. The families deserve to know their loved ones could have been saved. The source also provided additional context that made the cover-up even more inexcusable. The satellite that had taken the images was part of a routine monitoring program that photographed all shuttle missions as a security measure. The images hadn't required any special authorization or resources. They were standard intelligence community products that NASA had access to throughout every mission. This means NASA wasn't just refusing to request special imagery. Emma realized they were refusing to look at imagery that was already being collected as a matter of routine procedure. The breakthrough came when our anonymous source provided contact information for Dr. James Peterson, a former National Reconnaissance Office analyst who had processed the Columbia images in real time. Dr. Peterson had left government service in 2005. Frustrated by the intelligence community's failure to share critical information with NASA. "I've been waiting 20 years for someone to ask me about those images," Dr. Peterson told me during our phone conversation. "I knew immediately that Columbia was in mortal danger, and I tried to get that information to NASA through proper channels." Dr. Peterson's account revealed another layer of institutional failure. The intelligence community had recognized the significance of the damage and had attempted to alert NASA through established communication protocols, But NASA's liaison office had been instructed not to accept unsolicited intelligence products related to ongoing missions. It was a bureaucratic catch-22, Dr. Peterson explained. We had the information NASA needed to save the crew, but we weren't authorized to provide it without a formal request. And NASA wasn't making formal requests because they claimed they didn't need the intelligence. The satellite images represented the smoking gun. Our investigation had been missing concrete, undeniable proof that NASA had access to information that could have saved Columbia's crew but had chosen not to use it. The images also demonstrated the technical feasibility of the rescue mission that had been dismissed as impossible. Emma worked through the night, creating a comprehensive analysis of the images and their implications. Her engineering background allowed her to translate the technical details into language that families and media could understand. These images prove three things, Emma summarized in her report. First, that the damage was immediately detectable with available technology. Second, that the damage was obviously fatal to anyone with spacecraft expertise. Third, that there was sufficient time to plan and execute a rescue mission. But the images also raised troubling questions about our anonymous source and the circumstances of their release. Why now, after 20 years? Who had access to classified satellite imagery? And what legal risks might we face for possessing and publicizing classified materials? Patricia Hayes helped us understand the legal implications. These images were probably classified when they were taken, but the classification was likely related to the satellite's capabilities rather than the Columbia mission itself. After 20 years, much of that technology has been publicly disclosed. Still, we knew that NASA would likely claim the images were classified and that our use of them violated federal security laws. It was a risk we'd have to carefully consider as we planned our public disclosure. The images also provided powerful emotional impact that complemented our technical evidence. Seeing Columbia in orbit with visible damage made the crew's final days heartbreakingly real. These weren't abstract engineering failures, they were 7 people flying in a spacecraft that everyone knew was doomed. As dawn broke over Houston, Emma and I sat in our kitchen surrounded by printouts of the satellite images. The magnitude of NASA's betrayal was now undeniable, captured in high-resolution photographs that showed exactly what the agency had chosen to ignore. Dad's letter said the families deserved the truth, Emma said quietly. These images are that truth. They show that he and his crewmates didn't die because space is dangerous. They died because the people responsible for their safety chose institutional protection over human lives. The breakthrough we'd been seeking had finally arrived, delivered by someone inside the system who had apparently decided that 20 years of lies were enough. Now we had to decide what to do with the truth we'd spent so long trying to uncover. The official response letter from NASA arrived exactly 1 week after I'd submitted our formal complaint to Administrator Bill Nelson. The letterhead was impressive, the language was bureaucratic, and the dismissiveness was absolute. It was everything I'd expected and nothing I'd hoped for. Mrs. Coleman, the letter began, we have received your correspondence regarding the Space Shuttle Columbia accident investigation. While we understand your continued grief over the loss of your husband, we must respectfully disagree with your characterization of NASA's actions and decisions during and after STS-107. The response went on to defend every aspect of NASA's handling of the Columbia mission and subsequent investigation. The foam strike had been within acceptable parameters for shuttle operations. The decision not to pursue satellite imagery had been consistent with established protocols and risk assessment procedures. The post-accident investigation had been comprehensive and transparent. Each paragraph felt like a slap in the face, a renewed insult to Evan's memory and our family's pain. But what struck me most was how carefully the letter avoided addressing any of the specific evidence we'd presented. Instead of engaging with our documentation of cover-ups and concealment, NASA had simply reasserted their original narrative. Emma read the letter with growing fury. They didn't even acknowledge the satellite images or the classified memo, she said. They're pretending we never provided evidence that contradicts their official story. The letter's final paragraph was particularly galling. NASA remains committed to the safety of all space missions and to supporting the families of those who have made the ultimate sacrifice for space exploration. We hope you will find comfort in knowing that your husband's death contributed to important safety improvements that have prevented similar accidents. I'd requested a face-to-face meeting with Administrator Nelson, hoping that a personal conversation might accomplish what written correspondence clearly couldn't. To my surprise, NASA agreed to the meeting, though they insisted it be held at Johnson Space Center with multiple agency officials present. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in NASA's executive conference room, the same building where Evan had received his mission briefings 20 years earlier. Emma accompanied me, along with Patricia Hayes and attorney Michael Torres. Administrator Nelson was cordial but clearly uncomfortable. He'd inherited the Columbia legacy from previous administrations and had no personal involvement in the original decisions or cover-up, but he was also committed to protecting NASA's institutional reputation. Mrs. Coleman, I want you to know that NASA deeply regrets the loss of your husband and his crewmates, Nelson began. The Columbia accident was a tragedy that continues to shape our commitment to crew safety. But when I presented our evidence of On's letter, Patricia's classified memo, Sarah Williams' mission control transcript, and the satellite images, Nelson's response was disappointing and predictable. These documents represent the natural complexity of spaceflight operations, he said after a cursory review. Concerns and discussions are normal parts of mission planning and execution. The fact that various options were considered doesn't mean that NASA's ultimate decisions were inappropriate. Deputy Administrator Pam Melroy, herself a former astronaut, took a different approach. She acknowledged the validity of some engineering concerns while defending the institutional decisions that had been made. I knew Evan personally, Melroy said. He was a dedicated professional who understood the risks of I believe he would want his legacy to be continued space exploration, not endless recrimination about past decisions. It was a clever rhetorical strategy, using Evan's own commitment to the space program to deflect criticism of NASA's failures, but it was also fundamentally dishonest. Evan's letter had explicitly asked us to seek accountability if something happened to him. Patricia Hayes presented the technical evidence with devastating precision. She walked through the timeline of ignored warnings, the feasibility of rescue missions, and the deliberate concealment of critical information from both the crew and their families. NASA's response was to question Patricia's credibility and motivations. Dr. Hayes left NASA under difficult circumstances, one official noted. Her current allegations may be influenced by personal grievances rather than objective analysis. It was exactly the character assassination Patricia had warned us to expect. Rather than addressing her evidence, they were attacking her personally, trying to portray her as a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind. Emma's presentation of the satellite imagery was the most powerful moment of the meeting. The high-resolution photographs clearly showed damage that any spacecraft expert would have immediately recognized as fatal. These images were available during the mission, Emma stated. They showed damage that was obviously catastrophic. Someone chose not to use this information to save my father's life. NASA's response was to claim that the images were classified and that our possession of them might violate federal security laws. They also argued that the images had been processed with 20 years of hindsight and analysis techniques that weren't available during the original mission. The clarity of these images is enhanced by modern digital processing. One official claimed, mission controllers in 2003 wouldn't have had access to this level of detail. It was a lie, and everyone in the room knew it. Dr. Peterson had already confirmed that the damage was clearly visible in the original, unenhanced images, but NASA was committed to their narrative and unwilling to acknowledge any facts that contradicted it. The most frustrating aspect of the meeting was NASA's refusal to engage with the moral dimensions of their decisions. They treated the Columbia accident as a technical problem, rather than a human tragedy caused by institutional failures. We're not here to relitigate past decisions, Administrator Nelson said when I pressed him about the ethical implications of concealing information from families. Our focus is on current and future mission safety. But I wasn't going to let them off. That is, Mr. Nelson, you told 7 families that their loved ones died in an unforeseeable accident. We now know that multiple NASA employees foresaw exactly what happened and warned about it repeatedly. How do you justify lying to us for 20 years? The room fell silent. Nelson looked uncomfortable, clearly unprepared for such a direct challenge. When he finally responded, his words were carefully chosen and utterly inadequate. NASA has always provided the best information available at the time. Our understanding of the Columbia accident has evolved over the years, but our commitment to transparency has remained constant. Emma's response was swift and devastating. Transparency. You classified documents to hide them from congressional oversight. You reassigned engineers who raised safety concerns. You told my mother that my father's death was unavoidable when you knew it was preventable. That's not transparency, that's institutional cowardice. The meeting concluded with NASA's promise to review our submissions and provide a more detailed response within 30 days. But their body language and tone made it clear that no meaningful acknowledgement or accountability would be forthcoming. As we left the Johnson Space Center, I felt a mixture of anger and resolve. NASA's response had been exactly what we'd expected: bureaucratic deflection, character assassination, and institutional stonewalling. But their refusal to engage honestly with our evidence had also strengthened my determination to pursue public accountability. They're not going to admit anything voluntarily, Emma observed as we drove home. The only way we'll get accountability is through public pressure that makes their current position politically untenable. Patricia Hayes agreed. NASA has spent 20 years perfecting their Columbia narrative. They're not going to abandon it now just because families are asking inconvenient questions. But the meeting had also revealed something important about NASA's vulnerabilities. Their defensive posture and evasive responses suggested they were genuinely worried about our evidence. If they were confident in their original narrative, they would have engaged more directly with our documentation. That evening, I received a phone call from Dr. Susan Martinez, a current NASA engineer who had attended our meeting as an observer. She was calling from her personal phone, clearly concerned about official retaliation. "Mrs. Coleman, I can't say this officially, but many of us inside NASA know you're right," she said. "The institutional culture that led to Columbia hasn't really changed. We're still prioritizing schedule and budget over safety, just more carefully." Dr. Martinez's call was a reminder that NASA wasn't a monolithic institution. There were people inside the agency who understood the truth about Columbia and supported our efforts to hold leadership accountable. "Be careful how you proceed," she warned. "NASA's Public Affairs Office is already preparing a response strategy to discredit your evidence and your family. They're going to portray you as unreliable and emotionally unstable." It was exactly what Patricia had predicted, and exactly what we were prepared for. NASA's institutional playbook was predictable. When they couldn't attack the evidence, they attacked the messenger. The next morning, I called David Chen to discuss our media strategy. "We're going public," I told him. "NASA has made it clear they have no intention of acknowledging their failures voluntarily." David was ready. He'd spent weeks preparing multimedia presentations of our evidence, creating timelines and analyses that would be accessible to general audiences. "We'll start with a comprehensive website documenting everything you've discovered," he said. "Then we'll reach out to journalists who specialize in government accountability." But I also knew that going public would mean the end of any possibility for private resolution. Once we challenged NASA publicly, they would respond with the full force of their institutional resources. It would be a battle we might not win, but one we couldn't avoid. That night, I called each member of our Columbia Truth Coalition to confirm their commitment to public disclosure. Every family was ready to move forward, despite the personal costs we all understood we'd face. 20 years of lies are enough, Janet McCool said simply. "If NASA won't tell the truth voluntarily, we'll force them to confront it publicly." As I hung up the phone, I thought about Evan's final letter and his request that we asked hard questions if something happened to him. We'd asked those questions, and we'd discovered answers that NASA didn't want the world to hear. Now it was time to make sure those answers reached the people who deserved to know them: the American public who funded NASA, the future astronauts whose safety depended on institutional accountability, and most importantly, the families who had trusted NASA to tell them the truth about how their loved ones had died. The independent investigation report that Dr. Richard Steinberg presented to Congress was everything we'd hoped for and more. Titled Columbia, A Preventable Tragedy, an independent analysis of NASA's institutional failures. The 847-page document methodically dismantled 20 years of official lies and covered dash-ups. Dr. Steinberg was a former NASA administrator who had left the agency in disgust after the Challenger accident, spending the subsequent decades studying institutional failures in high-risk organizations. When our story broke publicly through David Chen's multimedia investigation, Dr. Steinberg had volunteered to conduct an independent review of our evidence. The The Coleman family's investigation has uncovered evidence of systematic institutional negligence that exceeds even my worst expectations, Dr. Steinberg announced at a packed press conference in Washington. NASA didn't just fail to prevent the Columbia disaster, they actively concealed information that could have saved 7 lives. The report's findings were devastating. Using our documents as a foundation, Dr. Steinberg's team had uncovered additional evidence of NASA's deliberate concealment and institutional cover-up. They'd interviewed dozens of former NASA employees, analyzed thousands of pages of previously classified documents, and reconstructed a timeline that clearly showed the agency's prioritization of political considerations over crew safety. The satellite images that our anonymous source had provided were independently authenticated by aerospace experts from MIT, Stanford, and the Air Force Academy. All concluded that the damage visible in the photographs would have been immediately recognizable as mission-ending, and that rescue operations were technically feasible. There is no reasonable doubt that Columbia's crew could have been saved if NASA had acted on the information available to them, Dr. Steinberg stated. The decision not to pursue satellite imagery and rescue options was driven by institutional cowardice, not technical limitations. The media coverage was extensive and generally supportive. Major newspapers published editorials calling for congressional investigations and accountability measures. Television news programs featured our story prominently, with technical experts confirming the validity of our evidence. Emma had become an effective media spokesperson, using her engineering background to explain complex technical issues in accessible terms. Her youth and expertise created a powerful contrast with NASA's older, defensive officials. My father trusted NASA to tell him if he was in danger, Emma said during a CNN interview. They betrayed that trust, and then they spent 20 years lying to our family about what really happened. This isn't about blame, it's about ensuring that future astronauts and their families can trust the people responsible for their safety. But NASA's response was swift and predictable. They released a detailed rebuttal questioning Dr. Steinberg's methodology, our evidence's authenticity, and our family's motivations. Their public affairs machine went into overdrive, producing statements and interviews designed to discredit our investigation. Mrs. Coleman is a grieving widow who has been manipulated by disgruntled former employees with personal grudges against NASA. One official told reporters, her amateur investigation lacks the technical sophistication and institutional knowledge necessary to understand complex spaceflight operations. The personal attacks were painful but not unexpected. NASA questioned my mental health, suggested that my grief had made me susceptible to conspiracy theories, and implied that I was dishonoring Evan's memory by challenging the heroic narrative of his death. But public opinion was shifting in our favor. Social media campaigns supported our investigation, and aerospace engineers from around the world provided technical validation of our findings. The hashtag Columbia whistleblower began trending, with supporters sharing our evidence and demanding congressional action. The breakthrough moment came when 3 current NASA engineers publicly supported our findings, despite obvious career risks. Dr. Maria Santos, Dr. James Liu, and Dr. Kevin Thompson released a joint statement confirming that the institutional culture we'd described still existed within NASA. The family's investigation has revealed systemic problems that continue to endanger current and future crews, their statement read. NASA's defensive response to legitimate safety concerns shows that the institutional failures that led to Columbia have not been adequately addressed. Congressional pressure mounted rapidly. Senator Elizabeth Warren called for immediate hearings, stating that NASA's credibility and the safety of American astronauts depend on a full accounting of institutional failures and Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez introduced legislation requiring independent oversight of NASA safety operations. The independent investigation report also revealed the extent of international concern about NASA's institutional culture. European Space Agency officials, who had been privately sharing safety concerns with each other for years, began speaking publicly about their observations of NASA's risk management practices. We have long been concerned about NASA's willingness to accept risks that other space agencies would consider unacceptable, said Dr. Johann Mueller, ESA's former director of human spaceflight. The Columbia family's investigation validates concerns that the international space community has harbored for decades. Most importantly, the report included specific recommendations for preventing future institutional failures. independent safety oversight, protection for engineers raising safety concerns, and mandatory disclosure of risk assessments to crew. Families were among the proposed reforms. Dr. Steinberg's team had also uncovered evidence suggesting that similar patterns of institutional negligence might exist in other NASA programs. The report called for comprehensive reviews of current missions and safety protocols to ensure that Columbia's lessons had actually been learned. The emotional impact of public vindication was overwhelming. For 20 years, I'd carried the burden of believing that Evan's death was a tragic but unavoidable accident. Learning that it had been preventable was devastating, but having that truth officially recognized was also profoundly healing. Emma's reaction was more complex. "I'm glad people finally know the truth about Dad's death," she said, "but I'm also angry that it took 20 years and a family's amateur investigation to uncover what NASA should have disclosed decades ago." The other families in our coalition experienced similar mixed emotions. We were vindicated but also heartbroken to have our worst fears confirmed. Our loved ones had died not as heroes exploring the frontier of human knowledge, but as victims of institutional cowardice and political calculation. Patricia Hayes was philosophical about the report's impact. "This vindication won't bring back the Columbia crew," she observed, "but it might save future crews by forcing NASA to confront institutional problems they've been denying for decades." The independent investigation report represented more than just validation of our evidence. It was proof that determined citizens could hold powerful institutions accountable when traditional oversight mechanisms failed. Congressional investigations, media coverage, and legal challenges had all fallen short. But persistent families, armed with undeniable evidence, had eventually forced the truth into the open. As I read Dr. Steinberg's conclusion, I thought about Evan's final letter and his belief that the families deserved the truth. The Coleman family's courage in pursuing this investigation, despite enormous institutional resistance, exemplifies the best traditions of American democracy. Dr. Steinberg had written, "Their dedication to truth and accountability honors both their loved ones' memory and our collective commitment to ensuring that such institutional failures never happen again." Public vindication felt like the first step toward justice, but it was only the beginning of a longer process of institutional reform and accountability. The truth was finally public, but ensuring that it led to meaningful change would require continued vigilance and pressure. The memorial plaque we unveiled at Arlington National Cemetery was simple but powerful, in memory of the Columbia crew, whose preventable deaths demand that we never stop asking hard questions about the institutions we trust with human lives. It replaced the original plaque that had perpetuated NASA's false narrative for 20 years. The ceremony was attended by hundreds of people, family members, former NASA employees, aerospace engineers, journalists, and members of Congress who had supported our investigation. But the most meaningful presence was that of current NASA astronauts who had quietly supported our efforts despite institutional pressure. "This plaque tells the truth about how our colleagues died," said astronaut Dr. Jessica Martinez, speaking for a group of current crew members. "That truth honors their memory better than any comfortable lie ever could." The Evan Coleman Foundation for Aerospace Safety was officially launched the same day, with Emma as its executive director and me as board chair. Our mission was to provide independent oversight of space agency safety practices and to support families affected by institutional failures in higher-risk government programs. Dad's letter said that the families deserved the truth. Emma said during her inaugural address, "Our foundation will ensure that future families never have to fight for 20 years to learn how their loved ones really died." The foundation's first initiative was a fellowship program for aerospace engineers who wanted to specialize in safety advocacy and whistleblower protection. We learned that institutional change required people inside the system who were committed to truth over institutional loyalty. Patricia Hayes became our first senior fellow, using her expertise to mentor young engineers and develop safety protocols that prioritized human lives over political considerations. Her experience with NASA's retaliation tactics was invaluable for protecting current employees who raised safety concerns. "The goal isn't to destroy NASA or stop space exploration," Patricia explained to our first class of fellows. "The goal is to create a culture where safety concerns are addressed honestly rather than suppressed for institutional convenience." The foundation also established a legal defense fund for government employees who faced retaliation for reporting safety issues. Our experience had shown that institutional accountability required protecting the people brave enough to speak truth to power. Michael Torres, the attorney who had helped us navigate the legal obstacles to our investigation, became the Foundation's general counsel. The government has spent decades perfecting legal immunity for institutional failures, he said. We need to develop equally sophisticated strategies for piercing that immunity. But the Foundation's most important work was educational. We developed training programs for families of high-risk government workers, teaching them how to ask the right questions and demand real accountability when things went wrong. The Coleman family succeeded because they refused to accept comfortable lies, explained Dr. Sarah Kim, our education director. We want to give other families the tools and knowledge they need to pursue truth from the beginning, not 20 years after the fact. Emma's work with the Foundation had given her a new sense of purpose. Instead of trying to solve engineering problems that had been solved decades ago, she was working to solve institutional problems that continued to endanger current and future crews. I used to think Dad's death was a technical failure that could be prevented through better engineering, she reflected. Now I understand it was an institutional failure that can only be prevented through better accountability. The memorial plaque dedication also marked NASA's grudging acknowledgement of institutional failures. While they never formally apologized for the cover-up, Administrator Nelson issued a statement recognizing the valid concerns raised by the Columbia families and promising renewed commitment to transparency and safety. It wasn't the full accountability we'd sought, but it was more acknowledgement than we'd expected. More importantly, NASA had implemented several of the reforms recommended by Dr. Steinberg's independent investigation. The agency established an independent safety oversight board with authority to halt missions based on safety concerns. They also created protection for employees who raised safety issues and mandatory disclosure of risk assessments to crew families. These reforms wouldn't have happened without the Coleman family's investigation, admitted Dr. Susan Martinez, the NASA engineer who had secretly supported our efforts. Sometimes institutional change requires external pressure that can't be ignored or suppressed. But the most meaningful aspect of the Legacy Project was its impact on other families facing similar institutional betrayals. We received letters from military families, nuclear workers, relatives, and others who had been lied to about how their loved ones died in government service. Your investigation gave us hope that the truth can eventually surface, wrote the wife of a nuclear submarine officer who had died in a classified accident. We're using your Foundation's resources to ask the hard questions the Navy doesn't want us to ask. The Foundation's work extended beyond aerospace to any high-risk government program where institutional secrecy might conceal negligence or cover up preventable failures. We'd learned that the patterns we'd identified at NASA existed throughout the federal government. Emma's graduation from MIT was bittersweet. She'd completed her aerospace engineering degree, but her career plans had fundamentally changed. Instead of working for NASA or an aerospace contractor, she was dedicating her life to ensuring that institutions served people rather than protecting themselves. I'm still honoring Dad's memory, she said during her graduation speech, but I'm doing it by making sure no other family goes through what we went through. The Foundation's first annual report documented significant progress in aerospace safety accountability. Several current NASA employees had used our legal defense fund to report safety concerns without facing retaliation. The Independent Oversight Board had halted 2 missions pending safety reviews, and 3 international space agencies had adopted our transparency protocols for risk disclosure. Institutional change is slow, but it's measurable, Emma observed. We're seeing real improvements in how space agencies handle safety concerns and communicate with families. The memorial plaque at Arlington had become a pilgrimage site for families seeking accountability from powerful institutions. People left flowers, notes, and photos of their own loved ones who had died due to institutional failures. This plaque represents more than just the Columbia crew, I realized during one of my visits. It represents the principle that, in a democracy, no institution should be allowed to escape accountability for the consequences of their failures. Foundation had also preserved all the evidence from our investigation in a public archive, ensuring that future researchers and families would have access to the documentation we'd fought so hard to uncover. 20 years from now, when someone questions the official narrative of an institutional failure, They'll have our investigation as a roadmap for how to pursue truth despite institutional resistance, Patricia noted. Looking back on the 3 years since our public disclosure, I was struck by how much had changed. NASA's institutional culture was slowly improving, aerospace safety had become a more transparent process, and families had better tools for holding agencies accountable. But the most important change was personal. Emma and I had transformed our grief into purpose, our anger into action, and our loss into a legacy that honored Evan's memory while protecting future families from similar betrayals. The Foundation's motto, taken from Evan's final letter, appeared on everything we published. The families deserve the truth, all of it. It was a simple statement, but it represented a revolutionary principle in institutions that had grown comfortable with secrecy and deception. As I stood before the new memorial plaque, reading Evan's name alongside his 6 crewmates, I felt a sense of peace that had eluded me for 20 years. He was finally being honored truthfully, remembered not as a victim of unavoidable tragedy but as a professional who had trusted his institution to protect him, and whose death demanded that such trust never be betrayed again. Evan's flight wings sit on my desk now, no longer hidden away in a drawer but displayed proudly next to a photo of Emma receiving her aerospace engineering degree. The wings represent dreams fulfilled and sacrifices honored, but they also represent something else: the power of truth to transform tragedy into purpose. 20-3 years have passed since that terrible February morning when Columbia broke apart over Texas. 3 years have passed since we finally learned the truth about what really happened and why. The journey from grief to acceptance to anger to action to healing has been longer and more difficult than I ever imagined, but it has also been more meaningful than I ever dared hope. The impact of our investigation continues to ripple through the aerospace community and beyond. The reforms we fought for have prevented at least 2 potential disasters, according to the Independent Safety Board's annual reports. Current NASA employees routinely use the protections we helped establish to raise safety concerns without fear of retaliation. Emma graduated from MIT with highest honors, but more importantly, she graduated with a clear sense of her life's mission. The Rachel Coleman Foundation has become a model for institutional accountability that other families and advocacy groups have replicated across government agencies. Dad's death finally means something, Emma said during her recent TED Talk about institutional accountability, not because he died as a hero exploring space, but because his death led to changes that have saved other people's lives. Emma's work with the foundation has taken her around the world, consulting with space agencies, military organizations, and other high-risk institutions about transparency and safety culture. Her engineering expertise, combined with her personal experience of institutional betrayal, has made her a staffed expert on organizational accountability. But perhaps the most healing aspect of our journey has been the relationships we've built with other families facing similar challenges. The Columbia Truth Coalition has evolved into a broader network of people seeking accountability from powerful institutions. We've supported families of military personnel killed in preventable accidents, helped relatives of nuclear workers who died due to safety violations, and provided resources for anyone facing institutional stonewalling after losing a loved one to organizational negligence. The pattern is always the same, Patricia Hayes observed during our 5th annual memorial service. Institutions protect themselves first, and truth comes second. But families who refuse to accept comfortable lies can eventually force accountability. Patricia, now in her late 70s, continues to work with the Foundation as our senior technical advisor. Her expertise in aerospace safety and her experience with institutional retaliation have been invaluable for protecting current employees who raise safety concerns. The memorial services at Arlington have become annual gatherings for the accountability community. Families, advocates, journalists, and reformed institutional insiders come together to remember those we've lost while recommitting to the work of preventing future losses. NASA's relationship with our foundation has evolved from hostility to grudging cooperation to something approaching partnership. Current Administrator Vanessa Weich has acknowledged that our investigation provided valuable insights that have strengthened NASA's safety culture. We don't always appreciate external criticism, Administrator Weich said during a recent speech, but the Coleman family's investigation demonstrated that outside perspective can identify problems that insiders might miss or be reluctant to address. The satellite images that our anonymous source provided in 2023 are now part of NASA's training curriculum used to teach mission controllers about the importance of seeking all available information when crew safety is at stake. The images serve as a powerful reminder of what can happen when institutional priorities override human considerations. Dr. Steinberg's independent investigation report has become required reading in aerospace engineering programs across the country. Universities use our case study to teach students about the ethical responsibilities of engineers and the importance of speaking truth to power. But the most meaningful validation of our work has come from current astronauts who have privately thanked us for creating a safer institutional environment. Several have told us that they feel more confident about their missions, knowing that safety concerns will be addressed honestly rather than suppressed. Your investigation saved my life, one astronaut told Emma during a private conversation. A safety issue I raised was taken seriously and addressed promptly because of the accountability mechanisms your foundation helped establish. Emma's personal life has also found new direction. She's engaged to Dr. Marcus Thompson, a fellow aerospace engineer who works on spacecraft safety systems. Their shared commitment to preventing institutional failures brought them together, and their wedding is planned for next spring. Marcus understands why this work matters, Emma said. He knows that our relationship isn't just personal, it's part of a larger commitment to ensuring that institutions serve people rather than protecting themselves. I've found unexpected peace in my role as the Foundation's board chair. The work is challenging and sometimes frustrating, but it's also deeply meaningful. Every safety reform we advocate for, every family we help navigate institutional resistance, every employee we protect from retaliation feels like a small victory for Evan's memory. The financial aspects of our investigation were resolved quietly through a confidential settlement with NASA. While the agency never admitted wrongdoing, they provided compensation that allowed us to establish the foundation and pursue our accountability work without financial constraints. More importantly, NASA agreed to ongoing transparency requirements that ensure families have access to complete information about mission risks and safety decisions. The days of comfortable lies and selective disclosure are over, at least in human spaceflight. Reflecting on the 20-year journey from Columbia's loss to our Foundation's establishment, I'm struck by how fundamentally my understanding of heroism has changed. Evan was heroic not because he died in space, but because he lived with integrity and asked his family to seek truth if something happened to him. The real heroes of our story are the whistleblowers like Patricia Hayes, the journalists like David Chen, the current employees who risked their careers to support our investigation, and the other families who refused to accept institutional lies about their loved ones' deaths. Emma keeps Evan's final voice recording on her phone, and sometimes we listen to it together during difficult moments in our advocacy work. His words remind us why accountability matters and why comfortable lies can never be acceptable when human lives are at stake. My beautiful girls, his voice still says, warm and loving across the decades. Ask hard questions, demand real answers. The families deserve the truth, all of it. That truth has been painful to discover and difficult to accept, but it has also been transformative. Evan's death was a preventable tragedy caused by institutional cowardice, but our response to that tragedy has helped prevent other families from experiencing similar betrayals. As I write this, Emma is preparing for her next international consultation, helping the European Space Agency develop better safety disclosure protocols. Patricia is reviewing safety concerns raised by current NASA employees. The Foundation's legal team is supporting a military family seeking truth about their son's death in a classified accident. The work continues because institutional accountability is not a destination, but a process, a constant effort to ensure that powerful organizations remember their responsibility to the people they serve rather than the bureaucracies they protect. Evan's flight wings catch the afternoon sunlight, streaming through my office window, a reminder of dreams fulfilled and sacrifices honored, but they're also a reminder that the most important dreams are not about touching the stars, they're about ensuring that the institutions we trust with human lives remain worthy of that trust. The families do deserve the truth, all of it, and sometimes, when institutions fail to provide that truth voluntarily, ordinary people must find extraordinary courage to demand it. That courage honors the memory of those we've lost while protecting the lives of those who follow in their footsteps.